Tonight, a momentous medical breakthrough in Alzheimer's. Researchers discover the first drug to slow the degenerative disease.
So far, it doesn't feel like there's been anything, and although it's just the beginning, it's at least a bit of hope that they're on their way to finding a cure.
Also making the headlines, children being left behind. Why young people across Scotland are starting life in poverty as the cost of living crisis leaves the worst off hardest hit.
Old friends and enemies, recreating the first ever international football match, 150 years on. And the Ukrainian children preparing to celebrate their first Scottish Christmas. I'm John Mackay in Glasgow.
And I'm Kellyanne Woodland in Edinburgh. This is the STV News at 6. Good evening. Today, a momentous medical breakthrough in the fight against Alzheimer's. For the first time, researchers have shown that cognitive decline with Alzheimer's can be slowed down. Around 45,000 people are living with the disease in Scotland, and currently there is no cure for the degenerative condition. The breakthrough comes after decades of failure, as Caroline Lewis reports.
Do you not know who I am? Linda, do you not know who I am? No. So
I knew she'd forget who I was at one point, and I'd always ask her my name just to make sure she didn't know who I was, and it was when that day came. It was difficult. It's the memories you miss, and that time they miss so many events in life, and that's what kind of steals from everyone.
Graham Sutherland's mum Linda was diagnosed with Alzheimer's 6 years ago, at the age of just 61. During lockdown, the 31-year-old from Erskine began documenting the reality of a family living with the disease.
Do you know wished? Should I wished?
Yeah.
It's touched a lot of people, and a lot of people contact me saying I've helped them, or even they don't feel as alone going through it, knowing that somebody else is doing the same thing.
Daylight come and we want to go home.
I don't think people realise the mental impact it has on you, because it's not just physical dealing with them, it's all around having to watch somebody slowly kind of fade away in front of you.
There's currently no treatment or cure available for people diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But what there is today is hope after a momentous medical breakthrough. A drug known as lecanemab became the first drug to show it's possible to slow the destruction of the brain. When someone has Alzheimer's, amyloid protein pieces start to clump together, creating a sticky gunge around the neurons in the brain, which stops them from working effectively. Lecanemab is an antibody, so it works by attaching itself to these proteins, triggering an immune response by the body, which ultimately breaks them down. The latest trial of the drug was tested on 1,795 people in the early stages of Alzheimer's. After 18 months, scientists found the drug slowed the rate of the disease by 27% when compared to patients taking the placebo. And although this difference is modest, it brings hope that Alzheimer's could be treated.
But I think we do have to be cautious, and this isn't a cure, and it will be some time before we have something that we can say, right, this is maybe, the hope is we can even reverse the symptoms and make people a little bit better, or certainly stop them in their tracks instead of continuing to decline, but more slowly. So I'm quite optimistic, but we're not quite there yet. I heard one person who I admire, John Schott, say this is the beginning of the end of Alzheimer's disease, and I hope that's the case.
If it proves successful, Graham hopes it will give families like his time they didn't have.
So far, it doesn't feel like there's been anything, and although it's just the beginning, it's at least a bit of hope that they're on their way to finding a cure.
So Caroline, put this in context. How important is this?
Well, it's undoubtedly a significant day. Scientists have failed for decades to make any headway when it comes to Alzheimer's, and even drugs very similar to this one have been tested and shown to know no benefit at all. So definitely significant, but it's very early days. There's still concerns about side effects, which include small bleeding and swelling of the brain.
And there's the big question is, do the concerns that people have outweigh the benefits, which at the moment are very, very small? So undoubtedly not a miracle cure. But what this does do is prove in principle that Alzheimer's can be treated. And what that will do will attract money and research. And hopefully that focus will mean that better, more effective treatments are going to be on the horizon.
Let's hope so. Caroline, thank you.
Children across Scotland are being failed by a lack of action on mental health, poverty and human rights by governments at both Holyrood and Westminster. That's according to the country's Children's Commissioner, who says young people are having their start to life severely hampered by a lack of quality affordable housing and the cost of living crisis.
In Scotland, where 1 in 4 children lives in poverty, struggling families do have support from local charities and projects. But the Scottish Government is being urged to use its devolved powers to do more. Here's Polly Bartlett.
At Maryhill Borough Hall, the charity Home Start are setting up for a celebration. But behind the smiles, life is challenging.
I moved into Glasgow. My life was at the edge. I didn't know anybody. I had moved into a new town with 2 young kids, and I was just looking for someone to talk to, someone who would listen to me even if I was uttering rubbish, but I just needed somebody who would listen to me and tell me that it is well.
It was Home Start that helped Leah get back on her feet. The community network offers advice and practical support to families with young children. Those behind it are marking the end of their busiest year yet.
COVID was really difficult. COVID was really difficult for everyone. It was particularly difficult for parents, for people with new babies who were very isolated and lonely in their own homes. Obviously, people's mental health was compromised. Statutory services, they're really saturated, so there's many referrals coming to Home Start.
Well, this help is essential. Today's report by the Children's Commissioner says families are being failed by a lack of action on poverty. He says the Scottish Government needs to use more of their devolved powers on things like food and housing.
It impacts on every single aspect of a child's life, not just their right to an adequate standard of living, a safe, warm home and nutritious food and clothes to wear, but it impacts on education, it impacts on mental and physical health, it impacts on the ability to socialise.
Local projects like Home Start can offer a lifeline to families. The Minister for Children was at the event but refused to speak to us.
Ms Hockey, any comment? Says the Scottish Government.
In a statement, she said that protecting children's rights is a top priority.
Is there any comment at all?
In the meantime, progress at a local level can be made by charities like this one. But campaigners are warning national policies are needed for any meaningful change. Polly Bartlett, STV News, Maryhill.
An expert witness has told the Sheku Bayoh inquiry reasonable officers should always try to build rapport with a suspect and contain them rather than rushing to use force.
Joanne Caffrey was giving evidence at the latest hearing into the events surrounding the death of the 31-year-old after being restrained by police in Kirkcaldy 7 years ago. Here's our senior reporter, Gordon Cree.
Joanne Caffrey is an expert in the use of force by police to restrain suspects. The inquiry asked her to produce a report on how a reasonable officer would deal with such incidents.
You're always trying to look at what is the lowest level of force that I can use for this. And use of force isn't just about the physical use of force. The moment you draw a baton or CS, that is a use of force. It's a level of force that you're using because there's the threat impact effect there.
And she said a measured approach is often more effective.
There is still an option of keeping that distance and constantly trying with that either verbal engagement, try and get the rapport, or you might back off a little bit more and just keep close following.
If you get sightings of the male, you need to make an initial assessment yourself.
Police were called to Hayfield Road in Kirkcaldy in May 2015 after reports of a man with a knife. The inquiry's previously seen video footage and radio messages and heard evidence that the first officers on the scene, Craig Walker and Alan Payton, had deployed CS sprays less than a minute after arriving. They've denied Mr Bayoh's race played any role in their actions. The 31-year-old died after being restrained in a violent confrontation involving a number of police officers. In the summer, we heard several of those officers tell this inquiry their actions were appropriate and justified, while today's evidence was perhaps more theoretical, looking at what a reasonable officer should maybe do in a particular scenario. It is clearly at odds with what they did do. Gordon Cree, STV News, Edinburgh.
Other stories across Scotland, and a record number of people have died in Scottish prisons in the last 3 years, according to a study by Glasgow University. There were 121 deaths in jails between January 2020 and September this year, with suicide and drugs deaths on the increase. The Scottish Prison Service says it's working with NHS and charities on suicide prevention. The Scottish Government says it has set up a Deaths in Custody Action Group to drive improvement.
CCTV footage of a teenage killer has been released after he was jailed for life for murdering a stranger following a day of drinking on his 18th birthday. Brian McKillop has been ordered to serve a minimum of 11 years and 3 months after admitting robbing and killing 51-year-old James Burton in Rutherglen last October. The teenager is seen walking away after the unprovoked and violent attack. Mr. Burton, who later died in hospital, was found by passing motorists.
Some schools will be hit by further industrial action next week as teachers in the SSTA and NASUWT take strike action on Wednesday and Thursday. All the teaching unions have rejected the latest Scottish Government pay offer. Action with the smaller unions will lead to the closure of secondary schools in East Ayrshire and some disruption in other parts of the country.
Almost 70% of people who died from asthma in Scotland last year were female. The Asthma and Allergy Foundation says death rates from the respiratory illness are at crisis levels after 96 people died from the condition in 2021. A mum from Glasgow whose daughter died after a severe attack wants non-prescribed inhalers to be included in first aid kits.
There's not enough awareness on how people... what to do when someone is having an attack. You can't just hand them an inhaler and say, fix yourself. It doesn't work that way. So people need to be educated on what to do around other people.
A watchdog has reported unannounced inspections of Glasgow's flagship hospital found generally good approaches to infection control. However, Healthcare Improvement Scotland warned the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital is under significant staffing pressures, with dozens of wards carrying a risk rating of red. NHS, Greater Glasgow and Clyde say an action plan has been agreed following the inspections in March and June, and infection control teams continue to be vigilant.
And Scotland's chief vet says that bird flu should not lead to a shortage of turkeys this Christmas. More than 220,000 birds have been culled in Scotland after being infected with the virus, mostly at farms in Aberdeenshire. Giving evidence to Holyrood's Rural Affairs Committee, the chief vet said there should still be enough for consumers this Christmas.
That 1.67 is for disease control. The normal Christmas market is about 10 million, a proportion of which are slaughtered early in the year and frozen. So turkey may be scarcer, but I'm not concerned that there isn't going to be any turkey around this Christmas.
The SNP's Westminster leader has challenged the Prime Minister to set out the democratic path for Scotland to achieve independence. Last week, the Supreme Court ruled Holyrood does not have the power to legislate for another vote without Westminster's consent.
The Prime Minister said he is respecting the results of the 2014 referendum. Meanwhile, independence campaigners say they will continue to fight to allow voters to have their say on Scotland's future. Our political correspondent, Ewan Petrie, reports.
In the hours that followed the Supreme Court's decision, the First Minister attempted to broaden support for a second independence referendum.
Today, our independence movement also becomes Scotland's democracy movement.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blandford.
1 week on, her party's Westminster leader asked the Prime Minister, if not a referendum, how could Scotland have its say on its future?
Can the Prime Minister finally tell people in Scotland the democratic path to escape Westminster control, to deliver independence so we can get back to the European Union.
Absolutely. Mr. Speaker, he talks about democracy and votes. I think the difference between him and I is that I respect the result of referendums.
But these independent supporters believe last week's legal ruling makes little difference to their campaign.
The Supreme Court ruling doesn't mean that Scotland isn't going to have its say. Scotland will have its say. It just makes it quite clear that we're going to have to fight to have that say.
What we have to do hasn't really changed as a result of last week, because we're not really interested in a referendum where we win 51-49. We're trying to build a whole country together.
And Mary, do you think holding a de facto referendum in an election is the right way forward?
Well, it's a way forward. We now have to focus on ways we can get out of an involuntary union, and there are various ways we can do it. And the de facto referendum is, it adds grist to the mill, but I wouldn't see it as the be-all and end-all.
Will it have the legitimacy that you would be looking for?
We still have to give the people of Scotland the chance to vote, and so I think a general election where it is clear that people are voting on whether or not there is a mandate for independence is the next best thing.
If the Yes movement doesn't get the level that it requires in an election like that, what then?
Well, it is a high-risk strategy with a lot to lose and not necessarily very many guaranteed things to win, because the UK government could ignore it, even if we get 100% voting yes.
For me personally, it's not a risk. We focus on SNP bad, union bad, and never about future Scotland good, and the conversation needs to be about what's future Scotland good look like.
The ultimate goal remains the same, but the Supreme Court's decision has thrown up fresh questions over how to achieve it. Ewan Petrie, STV News.
A dog rescue centre in Ayrshire has closed its doors to new rescues after being overwhelmed by demand. Isla Dog Rescue say the cost of living crisis is forcing people to reconsider whether they can afford to adopt a dog, and is leaving many with the difficult choice of giving up their pets. Vanessa Taff reports.
It's walkie time for these rescue pets. Come on. As the cost of living crisis bites, this rescue home has seen a surge in the number of pets left at their kennels.
Everything has shot up dramatically and people are really struggling with it. They're also scared if they do take a dog on, can they afford the insurance? Can they afford to buy the food even on a weekly basis? If they have a choice between do they feed their family or do they feed their dog, what can they do? We're inundated daily with people asking for rescue spaces for their dogs. More hand-ins now than ever before.
Archie here is just 14 weeks old. He's considered a designer dog. He's a Great Dane and Doberman Cross, but his owners didn't realise just how big he was going to get, so they handed him over here.
Staff call many of these pups the COVID dogs because they're young and have behavioural issues. Kennel managers are giving them specialised training.
People seem to be sort of taking a dog on the now, more for company, forgetting that they need that little bit of training, sort of the good manners, and then all of a sudden these dogs, they just can't control them anymore. So then they're ringing the rain, and here they are for us to hopefully put the training in place and get them back out there.
The team here hope with some extra volunteers and more breed awareness from pet owners, they can find new pet parents for these dogs and offer space again to those that need it. Vanessa Taff, STV News, Cumnock.
Oh, very cute. You can't compete with that, Ronnie.
I knew something was coming. Get
your fill of the action. STV Sport, sponsored by Papa John's Pizza.
Good evening. 150 years ago to the day, Scotland played England in a fixture that's remembered as the first ever international football match. Events have been taking place across the world to mark the historic occasion, and we sent Darren McRae along to the ground where it all began.
Sporting kit from a bygone era, pupils from Hindland Primary School recreate a moment in football history. They laced up their boots for a special version of the first official international match. It was Scotland versus England and kicked off on this day 150 years ago at Hamilton Crescent in Glasgow's West End. Watching on were two great-grandsons of one of the original Scotland team, Joseph Taylor.
We're both football supporters, and to have that in our family is just incredible, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a shame we didn't pass down the generations because none of us are any good.
Yeah.
Back in 1872, 4,000 spectators made their way into this ground to watch Scotland play England. The match itself wasn't one to remember. It finished goalless, but the occasion was a landmark moment for the Scottish game and world football beyond. Scotland's team back then was made up entirely of players from Queen's Park, who helped organise the match.
Queen's Park saw the future that day. They played at an enclosed ground, and what had happened was they raised enough money not only to cover the costs of the match, but it funded the reverse trip down to England the following year. So without that match and with all that money raised that they did, international football we maybe have had another stuttering start.
Those wearing the dark blue nowadays say it's great to look back at how the game as we now know it kicked off.
I'm sure football's played a lot differently now with what it was that day, and it was, as I say, it's just great to come along and see that the historic place where the first game got played, and that in what's now become a worldwide game from here.
While the two teams couldn't be separated back then, it was England who came out on top this time around, leaving Joseph's ancestors, who've since switched allegiances, delighted.
Yeah, and someone's just scored. England has just scored. There you go.
Oh dear!
No,
we won't get out of here.
Television, the telephone, and penicillin. Scotland has always been one of the world's great innovators. Its role in developing international football is another one for the history books. Darren McRae, STV News.
St Mirren manager Stephen Robinson admits he's not expecting to be able to sign any players in the January transfer window. The Saints return to training for the first time since the World Cup break, and Robinson says the club are keen to balance the books.
We won't be able to strengthen. The financial constraints in the football club probably dictate that we won't be able to strengthen the squad at this moment in time. We've got a good squad. We're happy with the squad, and unless things change or a lot of people leave the club, then we probably will be with what we are, which we're happy with.
Finally to golf, and fresh from turning professional, West Kilbride's Louise Duncan admits the first few months have been a huge challenge, but is targeting a memorable year in 2023. The Scot setting her sights on a place in next season's European Tour, and has recently secured a huge sponsorship deal to help her along the way.
Nice wee downhill here.
She may have crafted her trade on the fairways of West Kilbride Golf Club, but Louise Duncan has world domination in her sights. The 22-year-old heads to La Manga in a few weeks for one of the biggest tournaments of her career, and a chance to secure her place on the European Tour next year.
I think it's going to be a hard 2 weeks. It's not going to be easy by any means. So to just go out there, ultimately enjoy it, and play the golf I know I can play, is going to be huge for me, and in terms of next year as well.
After becoming world amateur champion last year, Duncan made the life-changing decision to turn professional in July. Since then, a top 20 finish at Muirfield at the Women's Open saw her pocket nearly £70,000. Duncan has recently partnered with investment firm Baillie Gifford, offering major support ahead of her first full season as pro. But she admits the early months have been difficult.
No, it's definitely been a big change, and yeah, like I said, a huge learning curve, and it is difficult. You're going in blind. You don't really know what to expect, and you don't know what you need and what you don't need before you actually trial and error it. So it's going to be a huge learning curve.
It has already been a strong start to her professional career, but now Louise Duncan is hoping for another huge performance to set herself up for an even stronger year ahead. All the best to Louise. Almost it. Last bit of snooker news from the Scottish Open. Stephen Maguire and John Higgins both through to the last 32.
Get your fill of the action. STV Sports, sponsored by Papa John's Pizza.
Sean has your weather forecast.
Things are hotting up. TUI sponsors STV Weather.
So for just now, we're going to be in the milder air over the next couple of days, still between that boundary of the warmer and colder air. Colder air to the east of us over Russia and Scandinavia. But watch what happens as we head into the weekend. We start to draw in an easterly, we start to drag in that colder air. And in about a week's time, we'll probably be looking towards Greenland, which could be sending us a northerly shot the end of the first week into the second week of December. Be keeping a close eye on that because that does increase our risk of some snowfall. So it looks as if it's some milder days, next couple of days, but then we go into the colder air, which could be here for quite some time. So turning milder from the west through tonight, the outbreaks of rain we've seen coming into the Hebrides drifting eastwards onto the mainland, and tomorrow's going to be one of those drab, dreary days. It'll probably be the sort of day you'll have the lights on most of the day. You might even have your Christmas lights on all day if you've already got them up. I have. A lot of cloud around, shower outbreaks of rain, misty weather over higher ground, but most of the rain tending to fizzle out by the end of the day, but still drab nonetheless. But it will be a little bit milder. Temperatures along the west coast, 10 to 12 degrees, 12 to 54 in Fahrenheit. Now we should see a little bit of brightness breaking through on Friday, but I expect still the risk of some drizzle around Ayr and also towards the likes of Fort William. Temperatures slowly starting to come down as we head through the weekend as that wind starts to swing round to an easterly.
TUI sponsors STV Weather.
And finally from us, Ukrainian refugees preparing their first Christmas away from home are being invited to a special performance of a famous play. An Edinburgh Christmas carol puts a Scottish twist on the Dickens tale.
Children in temporary cruise ship accommodation will sing carols during the interval of one of the shows, which will have Ukrainian subtitles. The Lyceum says it wants to extend a warm welcome to families after a harrowing year for their home country. Kay Nicholson has more.
These budding singers are among 300 Ukrainian children living on a cruise ship in Leith. Rehearsals are in full flow before they take to the stage at the Lyceum Theatre.
Children can sing our national song, our song that everybody know about, Червона Калина, and some Christmas song. And I want to say thank you everybody, for me and from other Ukrainians who lives here now.
Refugees from the ship and elsewhere will be guests of honour at an Edinburgh Christmas carol. The show on the 13th of December will have subtitles, and during the interval the children will perform.
Christmas Carol is deep down about an idea that Christmas is about how we connect to each other. I just think that's a really important message right now. I think it's an important message anyway, isn't it? But it's such a lovely message to be sharing with our Ukrainian guests.
It's past. No, don't work overtime, will you? You might make something of yourself.
For the actor who plays the infamously uncharitable Scrooge on the streets of Edinburgh, it will be particularly poignant. He hosted a Ukrainian family at his home in Stirling for almost 6 months.
We took the decision to do that kind of early on, really, because we got them in May, and the person that helped us get them is actually a Russian friend who lives in Edinburgh. So there was quite an interesting kind of line of connection there, which was good.
His guests now have a place of their own, and they'll be going to the show. If that doesn't put you in the Christmas spirit, then what will? Kay Nicholson, STV News, Edinburgh.
Absolutely heartwarming. Well, that is all from us tonight.
I'm back with Scotland tonight at 10:40. From all of us here, thanks for watching. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.